Hello everyone, and welcome to this video podcast on the last days. My name is David, and the title of this episode is The Lord Delayeth His Coming, with a subtitle emphasizing the fact that when it comes to the second coming, there shall be delays, and more delays before Christ comes in the clouds of heaven. This is episode 2. Why the numerous delays, you ask? And are they really delays? The answer to these two questions, I believe, can be answered in the parable of the 10 virgins, 5 of which were wise and 5 foolish. We will discuss the parable of the 10 virgins later in this episode, but for now, let us focus on these revealing words. While the bridegroom tarried, they all slumbered and slept, and at midnight there was a cry made, Behold, the bridegroom cometh, go ye out to meet him. What I want to take note of in this parable, and others like it, is this dual theme of preparation and separation. Yes, the Lord delayeth his coming, for the bridegroom tarried until midnight. But are they really delays, or an understanding on the Lord's part of this underlying theme of preparation and separation? After all, had the Lord not tarried, and had the bridegroom arrived on time, and in the early evening, rather than at midnight, would there not have been 10 wise virgins prepared for his coming, rather than merely 5? This dual theme of preparation and separation, then, is key to understanding the parable of the 10 virgins, and as to why the bridegroom tarried until the very last possible moment, midnight. This dual theme of preparation and separation, connected with the signs of the times in these latter days and the second coming of Christ, was touched upon in Gerald N. Lund's book, The Second Coming of the Lord, wherein his son mentioned to his father that he had recently read a New Testament passage in the Joseph Smith translation appendix that had given him cause for concern. But let me pick up what he said in his own words. He, my son, was troubled by the implications this passage holds for all of us today, who claim membership in the church. 2 verses had particular impact on him. And the servant who knew his Lord's will, and prepared not for his Lord's coming, neither did according to his will, shall be beaten with many stripes. For unto whomsoever much is given of him shall much be required. And to whom the Lord has committed much, of him will men ask the more. My son then observed, it seems like most authors tend to focus on the specific signs found in the prophecies in somewhat of an academic approach. But what the Lord cares most about is our preparation for what is coming. We know the future holds a great separation of the righteous from the unrighteous. So I'm wondering if, in addition to compiling a list of what is going to happen, we focus on that preparation, for it is preparation that gets us ready for the coming separation. Now, these observations are important because once we Latter-day Saints come to understand that Judgment Day is a day of separation, then we can come to understand more fully the significance of many of the Lord's parables concerning his second coming and this separation associated with this Judgment Day. In each of these end-time parables, we see this separation into 2 groups. For example, in the parable of the 10 virgins, we have a separation of the wise and foolish among us. In the parable of the wheat and tares, a separation of the righteous and wicked among us. In the parable of the sheep and goats, a separation of the caring and uncaring among us. And in the parable of the talents, a separation of the profitable and unprofitable servants among us. We see then that Judgment Day is clearly a day of separation and not a day of preparation. And so when it comes to the Lord delaying his coming to the very last possible moment, we can see this as the merciful delaying of this day of judgment or separation until the very last possible moment. There is, in effect, no rush to judgment on the Lord's part. This insight that the Lord delayeth his coming to the very last possible moment should alert us to the fact that we should prepare for the coming of the Lord with these delays, and more delays in mind. Hence the extra oil for our lamps. Besides the parable of the 10 virgins, what other examples do we have of the Lord delaying his coming until the very last possible moment? There are many, but I will only take the time to zero in on one And that is all the drama and trauma associated with Samuel the Lamanite's 5-year prophecy of Christ's birth, as this is another prime example in the Scriptures of the Lord delaying His coming until the very last possible moment. This story of Samuel the Lamanite's prophecy of Christ's birth, along with the signs of His coming, is a fascinating example of how the Lord delaying His coming to the very last possible moment can test the faith of the believers in Christ almost to the point of exasperation. In any event, we learn quickly that when it comes to the coming of the Lord in past times, or in these latter days, we will need the faith of Abraham and the patience of Job to see us through. Here then is Samuel the Lamanite's prophecy. And behold, he said unto them, Behold, I give unto you a sign, for 5 years more cometh, and behold, then cometh the Son of God, to redeem all those who shall believe on his name. And behold, this will I give unto you for a sign at the time of his coming. For behold, there shall be great lights in heaven, insomuch that in the night before he cometh there shall be no darkness, insomuch that it shall appear unto man as it was day. Now the problem is that the sign came in the commencement of the 92nd year, that is, in the 6th and not 5th year from Samuel's prophecy. Now there have been many Book of Mormon scholars trying to make sense of the chronological nature of what happened here. In fact, here is one of these scholars' attempt to map out the timeline. Notice that Samuel gave the prophecy near the end of the 86th year of the reign of the judges, but the sign did not appear until the 92nd year. In other words, when Samuel the Lamanite's prophecy was not fulfilled within the 5-year time period, then it created quite an uproar among the unbelievers who insisted that the time was past for the words of Samuel to be fulfilled. In short, this delay created a great deal of drama and trauma among the believers and non-believers of Christ to the point of threatening the lives of the believers. Apparently, a disagreement arose as to whether that 5-year time period had truly passed by, and a final deadline date was set. Now it came to pass that there was a day set apart by the unbelievers that all those who believed in those traditions should be put to death, except the sign should come to pass, which had been given by Samuel the prophet. Now to give you an idea of what was going on in the minds of both the believers and non-believers at the end of this 5-year timeline, consider the following verses. And they began to rejoice over their brethren, saying, Behold, the time is past, and the words of Samuel are not fulfilled. Therefore your joy and your faith concerning this thing hath been vain. And it came to pass that they did make a great uproar throughout the land. And the people who believed began to be very sorrowful, lest by any means those things which had been spoken might not come to pass. But behold, they did watch steadfastly for that day and that night and that day, which should be as one day, as if there were no night, that they might know that their faith had not been vain. Now it came to pass that there was a day set apart by the unbelievers, that all those who believed in those traditions should be put to death, except the sign should come to pass, which had been given by Samuel the prophet. Among the believers we see that the faith of Abraham and the patience of Job were in play here, as they watched steadfastly for the promised signs. But still, one wonders how many of these believers were prepared spiritually for this sort of test, and how many foolish virgins denied the faith once the heat was turned up and their very lives were on the line. Again, we see this preparation and separation theme playing out. To continue with the story, we see that Nephi, son of Nephi and grandson of Helaman, was so distraught that the final day had arrived for the fulfillment of this prophecy that he pled with the Lord and received this response. Lift up your head and be of good cheer, for behold, the time is at hand, and on this night shall the sign be given. And on the morrow come I into the world, to show unto the world that I will fulfill all that which I have caused to be spoken by the mouth of my holy prophets. With this assurance we then read, And it came to pass that the words which came unto Nephi were fulfilled, according as they had been spoken. And they knew that it was the day that the Lord should be born, because of the sign which had been given. And so we see that at the very last possible moment, on the very night of the final deadline, the sign is fulfilled. By our understanding this pattern of delay, and more delays, we too can expect a great deal of drama and trauma before the Lord comes a second time as well. But this particular delay of the coming of the Lord past the 5-year time period of Samuel's prophecy has raised a lot of questions on the part of many Book of Mormon scholars as they search for an explanation as to what really happened, particularly since a limited grace period beyond the 5-year period was somehow granted by the unbelievers to the believers as a short-term extension and as literally a drop-dead deadline. For the time was past for the words of Samuel to be fulfilled, and yet a brief extension period was agreed to, and so one wonders why. One of the interesting conjectures by these Book of Mormon scholars was that perhaps there were not one, but 2 calendars involved. In Mesoamerica, it is argued that there were 2 calendars, one based on a 365-day calendar called the Habs, and another based on a 360-day calendar called the Tons. These 2 calendars differ by 5 days per year, so over a 5-year period, that would make for a 25-day discrepancy between the 2 calendars. It is conjectured that perhaps the Lamanites' calendar that Samuel the Lamanite would have gone by was the 365-day calendar, while the Nephites were following the 360-day calendar. Technically then, and based on this 25-day discrepancy, the 5 years could have passed on the Nephite calendar, and yet there would still remain 25 days on the Lamanite calendar. Now this is mere speculation, but could account for the extended grace period and an exact drop-dead deadline being determined upon of exactly so many more days, and not a day more, as indicated by this red star and the 25-day discrepancy referred to in this illustration. The point in bringing all this up is not just the fascinating possibilities that could have been in play at the time, but that when it comes to prophetic timelines and prophetic prophecies, there may be more factors involved than we are aware of, making what appears to be a delay on the Lord's part not a delay at all, but an exact science had one been able to consult the Lord's timeline. Now, if a 25-day discrepancy based on 2 different calendars can cause havoc in ancient times pertaining to Christ's coming in the meridian of time, then what about any timeline discrepancies over a much longer 6,000-year period of time pertaining to the opening of the 7th seal? For instance, what if the date of the fall of man is off by a mere 30, 40, or 50 years? How would that discrepancy affect our prophetic timelines and end-time events? Would this not push the actual and pivotal year, 2000, out so many unspecified years, and truly make it impossible to know the day and the hour of the Lord's coming with any degree of accuracy? I mention all this as a cautionary note to all those who believe they have pinpointed the year 2000 as the opening of the 7th seal, and only ask them to consider the possibility that this date may be accurate as far as the birth of Christ is concerned, but that hardly verifies that the previous 4,000 years were accurately calculated. In other words, it leads one to ask whether the Lord has really delayed his coming, now that it is 2022, or whether the previous 6 1,000-year time periods are off by a number of years. But I digress, so let's return to our original argument that, regardless, that it will appear to all the faithful that the Lord delayeth his coming. Are there other examples wherein the Lord delayeth his coming until the very last possible moment? Yes, I'll mention 2, and then we will move on. There is, of course, the drama and trauma of Moses and the children of Israel crossing the Red Sea with Pharaoh and his armies breathing down their necks. And in our own day, there will be the drama and trauma associated with the Battle of Armageddon and Christ's appearance on the Mount of Olives at the very last possible moment to save the Jews from the desolation of abomination which is taking place throughout Jerusalem, wherein half the city has been pillaged, ravaged, and slaughtered, while the rest of Jerusalem is fleeing for their lives with no hope of deliverance. Yes, the Jews are saved, and the wicked are destroyed by the thousands, but not until the very last possible moment when all appears to be lost. Let's begin to wind up this episode by asking a few last questions and reiterating a few final points. As to the parable of the 10 virgins, we could ask, had the bridegroom not tarried, what lessons would have been lost? Would this dual theme of preparation and separation have been so readily taught by the Savior? After all, had Christ arrived in the early evening and at the appointed time, would not all 10 of the virgins have been prepared to meet him? Wasn't it only after he tarried, when the Lord delayeth his coming, that the needed lesson was taught? And as to the prophecy of Samuel the Lamanite, wherein the time was past for the words of his prophecy to be fulfilled, could we not ask, had this sign of Christ's birth come days sooner, what lessons would have been lost? Would this dual theme of preparation and separation have been as readily taught by this Book of Mormon story? After all, had Christ come days, weeks, or perhaps even years sooner, could not all the drama and trauma of this drop-dead deadline have been avoided? Again, wasn't it only after he tarried, wherein the Lord delayeth his coming the first time, that the needed lesson was taught? In conclusion, then, we see in the last days and end-time parables a dual theme of preparation and separation. And are we not put on notice that Christ delayeth his coming until the very last moment? And why? Because Judgment Day is a day of separation, not preparation, and the Lord would prefer to grant us a grace period wherein we might better prepare. We end then with another prophetic timeline alert. While keeping this dual theme of preparation and separation in mind, whenever we think of the last days and the coming judgments of God, that there is always this one thing we know and can count on, and that is this, that Christ will delay his coming until the very last possible moment. And so I ask everyone, including myself, are we delaying our repentance until the very last possible moment as well? Is this a game of chicken we really want to play? And is this perhaps the reason why the Lord has refused to tell us the day or the hour of his coming, to keep us honest and on our spiritual toes? With the coming delays, and more delays, leading up to the coming of the Lord in these latter days, it should not surprise you that the next episode in this series on the last days is a more in-depth discussion of the parable of the 10 virgins, with the subtitle of Oil, Oil, and More Oil. As the more delays there are, the more oil we will need for our lamps. Thank you for watching. Push the like button if you enjoyed this episode, and be sure to push the subscribe button. Until next time, stay vigilant, for you know neither the day nor the hour of his coming.